going to contrast here, as Oken does, is two different kinds of institutions. Political institutions, and then economic institutions. And what he does in this wonderful piece of work is to define each one. So he's going to define what a political institution is. And he says, the first thing to know about political institutions is political institutions provide universally distributed rights and privileges that proclaim the equality of all citizens. That's how he defines what a political institution does. It does this in ways that we get these rights and privileges without expending any cost. We don't pay for these things. He says, as an economist, it actually, these political rights and privileges violate the law of comparative advantage. And what he means by that, taking this from trade theory, is that people who have a great stake in a certain right have no more right to it than others, right? I'm an academic, I'm a professor, I have a tremendous stake in our right of freedom of speech. Without it, I'm useless. I have no profession. There are people who really don't care very much about speaking up about anything. Nonetheless, they have as much freedom of speech as I do, which violates the idea that those who want something more should have more of it, or produce more of it should have more of it. Not here. It's also equal with regard to ability or intelligence. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, right? You don't have to pass an IQ test. You don't have to do really well on the SATs. You don't have to be on the dean's list here at Northeastern. We allow you the freedom of speech. It's not distributed as incentives. We don't use rights or these privileges as incentives. We don't use them to get you to do something. We don't say, if you behave, you have the freedom of speech. If you do X, you get the freedom of assembly. It's very different, we're going to find out in a few minutes, from market goods. And, as a matter of fact, the whole idea of rights and privileges actually violates equity and freedom. Everyone must pay for the right, regardless of who uses it. I have friends of mine who have chosen to remain childless, and they help pay for my kid to go to school. That's the way it works. And so it, in a sense, violates their freedom from being able to decide whether they want to pay for someone else's kid's education. And of course, rights and privileges essentially, at least in theory, can't be bought and sold. We don't say you can buy the freedom of speech. Okay? As such, Oken tells us that our rights can be viewed as inefficient in an economic sense because they preclude prices that would promote economizing. Since we don't put a price on it, it's free. Anything that's free, people often waste. Since there's no price for free speech, too many people use it too freely. It violates the law of comparative advantage, as I suggested. We academics are so smart, have no more right than others. It does not permit incentives that would augment socially productive effort. If speech were a market good, people would work harder to obtain it. It precludes trades that potentially would benefit buyer and seller alike. Starving person, at least in theory, is not allowed to trade his vote for a loaf of bread. Even though, if that were a voluntary transaction from a point of view of economics, total welfare would be improved. Starving person gets to eat. Person who wants an extra vote gets the extra vote. But we preclude that, and in that sense, it violates what economists would see as an efficient system. Let's take a look at economic institutions very quickly. Well, they rely on market-determined incomes that generate substantial disparities among citizens in material welfare. Right? Some get more, some get less. Differentials in income, which are generated, are then meant to serve as incentives, rewards and penalties to promote efficiency. And that's the way we get more efficient use of resources. So we don't waste resources, unlike rights, in which we're wasting resources, in a sense, all the time. And here then becomes the big trade-off. When do you want something to be a right and, in a sense, get all these inefficiencies? And when do you want it to be a market good and take advantage of those? As Oken tells us, and I'll quote directly from him, equal rights and unequal incomes generate tensions between the political principles of democracy and the economic principles of capitalism. And that is kind of the fundamental conflict. And the point I'm going to make in a few minutes is that all of politics is based exactly on that statement and on this idea of economic versus political institutions. Okay? In the end, Oken tells us this isn't so much a fundamental inconsistency as an uneasy compromise. Indeed, I'm going to argue we're constantly trying to figure out where we're going to be on a continuum between rights and market goods. Okay? But before we do that, maybe we need to ask the question, if rights are so inefficient and they violate comparative advantage, why should we have them? And he suggests 3 reasons. One is liberty. The real reason why we have rights, including the Bill of Rights in the Constitution, is not so much to protect individuals from other individuals, it's to protect individuals from the government. Right? You have the freedom of speech not to be violated by the government, unlike some countries where this happens on a regular basis. So one reason for rights is you do not want to have such a pervasive government that everyone is unprotected from its power. Freedom of speech, universal and identifiable criteria used rather than discretionary. So you have something like the Bill of Rights, and we have people who are very strict interpreters of those Bill of Rights. In fact, we're going to have a Supreme Court case, I think, this week, which has to do with unreasonable search that was discussed this morning on NPR. The second reason for rights is pluralism. Rights are a protection against the intervention of the market in everything we do. If we only had market goods, right, everything would become a commodity, including a bunch of things that we probably wouldn't want to be as commodities. The example he uses I love, Olympic medals. You really wouldn't want to be able to say, well, somebody just because they're very rich can have a gold medal. No, you actually have to earn it because you're faster, or you can jump higher, or you're a better skier, or a better diver, or whatever. Doesn't matter how much money you have. So you don't want the market everywhere. And rights provide an alternative through pluralism. And finally, just on the basis of humanism, a stress on human dignity, mutual respect for each other without always a quid pro quo. I'm going to respect you not because you give me something back. I'm going to respect you because you're a human being, a fellow human being. Okay? So let's take a look at rights versus marketable commodities. The real question I want to raise, therefore, is how far should we go in ensuring rights? When should we turn a market good into a right? Or are there certain rights that we should actually turn back into market goods? Free speech. That seems like one that we would certainly want to be as a right. How about free public education? Very interesting. We have free public education, kindergarten through 12th grade. And then we say it's a market good. You want to go to community college, you want to go to Northeastern, you want to even go to UMass, you got to pay. So we have a free good right through the 12th grade and a right, and then we turn it into a market good. And what's interesting is despite all of our understanding about the importance of education and training in this information age, we still haven't added any more to the right to education that we had 100 years ago. What about the right to pollute? Should people have the right to pollute? Right? It's my property. Should I be able to dump oil in my backyard when I change the oil on my car? My property. Well, maybe. Free housing. We're going to be releasing our housing report card on October 25th, and one of the things we're going to be talking about is affordable housing. Should the government subsidize housing? Should anybody be subsidized for their shelter? Public welfare, big issues back in the 1980s and 1990s, including Clinton's welfare reform program. The right to a job. Do people have a right to a job? Some of the people who are occupying Wall Street saying, well, you know, where are the jobs? I have a right to a job. Do you have a right to a job? Or is it a market good? Right? The other thing is that we have bans on exchange. By prohibiting your sales of rights, society encroaches on your freedom. But it also protecting you from others who might take your rights away. A couple example, child labor laws. Some families absolutely need their children to work, certainly in other countries, for the family to make ends meet. In this country, we don't allow it. We take the right away from the family to send their kids out to make money. We have minimum wage laws, right, which most people support, not all, but they prohibit workers from offering their labor at any wage they choose, and that may, in some cases, mean they don't get a job they could otherwise have. I'd hire you, except you're not worth the minimum wage, and therefore I can't give you work. The government is keeping me from employing you. The government is keeping me from employing you. On the other hand, we have a lot of cases in which things that we think should be rights get trampled by the market. Good example is legal services. O.J. Simpson was able to get a phenomenally good lawyer. Other people can't afford such good legal representation. And therefore, some would argue that they get preferential treatment before the law, when in fact, at least according to our Constitution and our Bill of Rights and our belief that everyone should have a right to a fair trial. We certainly know that you can buy a better political platform through campaign financing. And this is particularly true in light of what I would consider personally the worst Supreme Court decision maybe ever in Citizens United, which makes it possible for almost unlimited amounts of money to almost buy elections. And of course, lobbying by means of pecuniary offers and so forth. So, here's what I want to do in closing. This is Bluestone now. This is not Oaken, but it's based on Oaken, and it takes Oaken and it turns them into a graph. Okay? So what I've done here is I've said, let's think of a continuum in which all the way over on that side you have rights. That's on my right side, your left. And over here we have market goods, right? And there's a continuum. And the way to think about it is, rights are, again, things that are where we don't use them as incentives. There's no quid pro quo. We basically declare equality of all. Whereas a market good is a good in which we distribute it in order to produce incentives and disincentives. It's produced on the basis of quid pro quo, this for that. And essentially because of that, it usually means there's significant inequality. So let's take those two extremes, okay? I have some good ideas about what rights are, right? Freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion. These are what many of us would consider, at least in our country, to be inalienable rights. We put them all the way at the end of the rights market goods continuum on the rights end, okay? Anybody want to give me an example of what you might call a perfect market good? And what I mean by a perfect market good, all the way at the other end of the continuum, is something that no one ever, ever, never, ever should be able to obtain without essentially a quid pro quo, paying for it. Anybody have a guess? Just shout it out.
A yacht.
A yacht. Okay, a yacht. Anyone else?
Healthcare.
A golf cart? I missed that.
Healthcare.
Healthcare. Right? You think that should be a market good? You only get, oh, I want to look at a market good, okay? You're going to put healthcare maybe over near the rights thing. Let's wait.
Property.
Sorry?
Property.
Any property should be, so no one should have any property whatsoever unless they pay for it. Good, okay. I'll tell you what mine is. It's diamond pinky rings. I don't think anybody should have a diamond pinky ring unless they pay for it. No one. Ever. Never. Okay? So we've got our continuum nailed down. At one end, rights like freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of religious expression. At the other, diamond pinky rings. Okay? And let's just, for the sake of it, maybe you'll disagree with me, let's just for the sake of it agree that that sounds good to us. Now I'm going to argue everything else is hard to define where it should lie on here. Where should it be on the continuum? Okay? So there's our continuum. Let's think about food. Okay? Some people here might say, food should be a market good. You can't pay for it, you don't eat. You don't eat, you die. Tough. It's a market good. Most people actually don't believe that. Okay? And in the 1920s through the 1930s, we actually developed county welfare programs where we had a county welfare worker in a pickup truck, and they would run around, mostly in rural areas, and distribute free food to people who are indigent. 2 pounds of lard, powdered milk, right? Some powdered eggs, right? A little Spam, right? And that's what you ate, because we thought that you had a right, rather than a market good, to a minimum food diet. Wasn't very tasty, but it was, to some extent, kept you alive. A little while later, 1930s, I'm sorry, by the 1930s we had this system. Before that we didn't even have that system. We basically relied on the church to distribute food. And we had the county welfare worker. And then in the 1960s we developed a food stamp program. We make food, in a sense, more of a right. Now you get food stamps. And you don't have to just eat the lard and the powdered milk and the powdered eggs. You can actually go to the supermarket. And while there's certain things you can't buy, pet foods for example, or liquor, you had a choice. If you actually wanted to buy a nice piece of porterhouse steak, you could do it. You wouldn't have much other food, but you had some rights here to food. So if somebody had said, rather than diamond pinky rings, porterhouse steak, I would have said, no, not in our country. Food stamps allow you to do this, to have this as a matter of right. Right? You qualify for it if you're sufficiently poor. Okay? Let's look at housing. There might be a time in which we would have said, property, housing, you can't pay for it, you don't get it. You live in a tent, you live outdoors, you're homeless. And then, whoops, I want to go back. Help me here. None of the buttons work. All right. We had public housing. We built these big public housing projects. We stuck people in them, and we said, if you need housing, this is your housing. You're on the 14th floor, right? Apartment 14G. Not very nice housing. Most of those projects turned out to be rather disastrous, particularly like Pruitt-Igoe in St. Louis, or the Robert Taylor homes in Chicago, or some in Detroit that I knew well. And then we developed the Section 8 housing program. Right? Section 8 says you get a voucher. With a voucher, you can go out if you need housing and you're poor enough, and you can go out and rent housing and be subsidized by the federal government, and in some cases even the state. So we moved housing from a market good to somewhere to the left, and finally more to being a right. So what's your favorite to make a market good? You know, what would you like to make a market good? And hi. Let's just go through this very quickly. We will get this fixed one of these days. So here's home ownership. That's what I wanted to do. Okay? Home ownership. We then developed, FHA, VA, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, mortgage interest deduction. We encouraged housing. In fact, we subsidized it. Home ownership, not just a rental piece of property. We subsidized it in lots of ways, right? Now we're talking about possibly moving in the other direction. I mean, so far I've been looking at things that seem to go from market goods to rights. We're now talking about the possibility of a diminished role for Fannie Mae, a diminished role for Freddie Mac, which may reduce significantly the ability of people who don't currently own homes to buy them in the future. Maybe eliminate the mortgage interest deduction, which has encouraged home ownership. I've done a whole chapter in our new housing report card on whether that's a good idea or not. But here we're thinking about moving back in the other direction. Here's healthcare, 1950s. Mainly a market good. Maybe you could find the emergency room would take care of you, but if you couldn't pay for it, the doctor didn't have to do anything for you. And then we got Medicare and Medicaid in 1960s. And then we got Obamacare in 2010. And the question is, where are we going? Are we going to move toward even more universal coverage? Or are we going to move in the opposite direction? All right? How about a job? Right? Well, do you have a right to a job? I asked that question before. Are we moving in this direction, where people actually have a right to a job? Should we? Freedom of speech. Here's the Citizens United Supreme Court ruling, suggesting that even freedom of speech may be becoming more of a market good rather than a right. All political discourse, where on the continuum do you place something? Conservatives generally favor keeping as much as possible as market goods. Jim may make that case. We'll see. Liberals generally favor expanding rights. So all of our political discourse, in a sense, can be siphoned down to this one continuum. Think about where we want to be on that rights, goods continuum. And I would argue that today that battle is perhaps more divisive than ever, particularly if you look at what's happening in the United States Congress. So, here are my final questions, and I'm just going to raise them. What's your favorite candidate for a new right? And what's your favorite to make a market good? So, a beginning. Now, I would like to turn it over to Jim Stergios, who is going to give us his interpretation